Our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. These are the words uttered by the people of Israel in our passage, the words of despair that come from their lips. Our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. These are the words of people who have experienced exile and slavery, the words of a people who thought they were already powerless until they lost what little power they had in the face of a foreign enemy. The ancient Israelites were almost never the strongest nation in their region. Yes, there was a brief period of glory during the reign of David and Solomon. There was a time when the 12 tribes were united as one nation, and under the leadership of these two great kings, there was a time of power. There were civil wars and internal conflicts during that time, but under David and Solomon, Israel experienced the widest reach of its territory, the strongest flexing of its muscles. Under these two kings, they won military victories. They amassed wealth. They built an incredible temple to God. But there had been perhaps 6 or 7 centuries since the rule of David and Solomon and these words in Ezekiel 37. There had been perhaps 600 or 700 years since Israel was at the height of its power until now in our reading when Israel is in the depths of despair. Our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. In this statement, they are so completely lost, so utterly down in the depths that they do not even think to cry out to the Lord. And why should they? In the intervening centuries, where has the Lord been? When God's chosen people were split into 2 nations by a king's malice and greed, where was the Lord? When they were conquered by foreign army after foreign army, where was the Lord? When they paid humiliating tribute to a succession of empires just to keep the howling wolves at bay, draining their national treasures for the sake of safety, where was the Lord? And then at last, when the Babylonians came, tearing down the Lord's temple and destroying the gates of the Lord's city, when they carted vast swaths of the population back to Babylon to serve as slaves in a foreign land, and when those exiles returned to find their nation in ruin, where was God in each successive step of their degradation? Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely, cut off from one another, cut off from hope in the future, cut off, we might even say, from God, whose name they do not even utter. Of course, the Lord might tell the story differently. God might tell the story of a chosen people who refused to believe in their chosenness. The Lord might say that here was a nation commanded to be the opposite of most of the nations in the world. Rather than having a succession of kings and living at the whim of their virtue and greed, this people would be ruled directly by God. That was the plan. Rather than draining their resources for a standing army, this nation would rely on the Lord for its protection, or at least that was the plan. Rather than always seeking after more than what they were given, this nation would be content with a promised land, grateful for the gifts of God within the borders you were trusted to hold. At least that was the plan. Rather than striving to become an empire, rather than living like every other nation, Israel was set up to be different. But they didn't believe strongly enough to be different. And so rather than trusting in God's promises, they wanted to stand on their own unsteady feet. Rather than trusting that God had given them enough, they greedily grasped for more, just like all the other nations of the world. Rather than being ruled by God, they chose a line of human kings. God might say, I gave them every chance in the world to be my people. They chose instead to be their own people. But even when all hope seems lost, God is able to move. Even, and I would say especially, when all hope seems lost, God is able to act. Because when we finally give up trying to do it all on our own, we make room for the Lord to work. When we finally decide that our way isn't working, God is able to act. There are times when people ask themselves, there are times when people ask me, why doesn't God speak to people today like he did in the Bible? Or why doesn't God perform miracles like he did back then? And I wonder if it's because our ancient elders had a greater capacity for giving up. I wonder if they relied less on themselves and more on the power of prayer. I wonder if they were more willing to take chances, more willing to take a step onto a limb and try something completely out of their comfort zones and give more than they ever thought they could because they believed that God would be out on the limb by their side. They would face down a giant because they believed that God would be with them. I wonder this because those qualities of being able to not rely on ourselves but on God, those qualities seem to be prerequisites for God's willingness to speak and move and appear in those tangible ways that we don't seem to feel anymore. In the Bible, you never hear about the person who always stood on their own 2 feet, who always pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, who never took a handout, never accepted help, and then received a miracle. The recipients of miracles are barren women who have given up on having children, unwed teens who seem completely unfit for raising a Messiah, cowardly leaders who don't believe in themselves and will only act if God absolutely proves beyond a doubt that he's going to be there. The heroes of the Bible are strong men who are shorn of their strength and are humiliated and mocked and bereft of all hope. And then and only then can they bring the pillars down and save the day. When people in the Bible stop acting on their own strength and start praying, that's when God brings a miracle. And that's why we see resurrection in our passage this morning. When the people were finally ready to say, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off completely, God had room to breathe new life into dry bones. God could find an ancient army of soldiers fallen in battle with Babylon. God could find this field of undug graves and form them into a living army, form muscles around those bones and skin to cover the muscles and breathe life to animate their bodies. The miracle here is not, of course, that God literally raised an army from these foreign soldiers. It's not that God literally raised the bodies of these dry bones. It's that the Lord inspires the people to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed, to find new life in ancient laws and stories, to reclaim their identity as a people. When they gave up, that was when God was able to breathe new life into them and make them into Israel once again. In my life and in my ministry, I have seen many resurrections, and they follow the pattern of Jesus and his resurrection, of the Israelites and their resurrection, where new life is preceded by death, where a new beginning can only come in the wake of an ending. I've seen people experience the death of joblessness and a hard search for meaning and provision who eventually find resurrection in a career that is deeply meaningful for them. I've seen people experience the loss of a marriage, but eventually find new life in the form of a love that wasn't ready for them decades ago. I've seen people grow older and wiser, examine the things they've acquired over a lifetime, and realize there was a certain sense of meaninglessness in it. These same people then downsize, giving away their things and purchasing smaller homes and finding new life without the burden of so many objects to care for, even as those objects find new life in homes where they are needed. Our lives, our journeys are a succession of endings and beginnings, a succession of deaths and resurrections, and that is easy enough to see in hindsight with the wisdom of experience, but when you're in the thick of loss, when you're wandering in the desert, when the darkness has enclosed you, when you cry out, our bones are dried up and my hope is lost. Oh Lord, I am cut off completely. In those moments, It can be almost impossible to see the buds of new life forming underground in the darkness, but it's in the darkness where God is at work. It's in death where God forms the beginning of new life. It's in loss where God can be present. It's out of despair and the loss of hope in ourselves that God is finally free and able to work a miracle. And I mention all this today on All Saints' Day, on the day when we celebrate the saints of God, by which we mean all the people who strive to follow God, living or dead, because I think it's our elders among us who understand these truths most of all. Those who have lived the greater parts of their journeys, those who have experienced all the ups and downs of life, those who have known a continuous stream of endings and beginnings, and who have seen by the grace of God the miracle of beginnings they never expected. Those people know. Our elders know. They know to stop and smell the roses because they might not be growing there tomorrow. They have eyes to see the gift of the present moment and the gift of being alive each day. When I ask our elders among us for the highlight of their week, they talk about waking up each morning. They appreciate the gift of each day. They know each day is a miracle. And they tend to see life with a wider-eyed lens, knowing there are a lot of things they once thought were terribly important that don't seem so important anymore. Many things they once fought about that have now faded into dust. It's our living saints who have the most experience of life, who can pass on the keys to contentment. And those keys are, first of all, be grateful for the gift of what you have. And second, if it's worth striving for, it's worth praying for. On this day, when we celebrate all the saints in our midst, both those who are present in body and those who live on in our hearts and memories, we thank God for these saints, for their example and for their wisdom. We thank God for Scripture, which calls us to let go and let God work a miracle. And we thank God for death and new life, knowing the darkness must precede the light. The despair must come before the joy. The ending must come before God can bring the miracle of resurrection. This morning, we are continuing our practice of reviving a tradition of the earliest churches, greeting each other through the passing of the peace before we meet together at the communion table. And this morning, passing the peace will end when we return to our seats and sing the third verse of For All the Saints, which is printed in your bulletin. After we sing, we will intone the saints, calling out the names of those saints who have passed on to the next life, the ones who live in our memories and whose stories hold us fast today. After we sing, we will intone the names of those saints, raising our hands and waiting to be acknowledged by the pastor. We will name a saint, hear the name repeated by the pastor, and then hear the bells ring in their memory. Afterwards, I will offer a prayer ending in the Lord's Prayer. Now, because this intoning of the saints will happen in the place of our regular sharing of joys and concerns, please tell me your joys and concerns as we pass the peace so I may include them in our prayers. And now, with all that said, we come to a time of sharing peace, a time of reconciling and reconnecting and connecting with those we have not yet met. This morning, let us share God's peace, affirming as we do that we belong to each other in a wider body of God's saints and that we also belong to God. Friends, may the peace of Christ be with you. Let us exchange signs of peace.